President Trump's former campaign chairman back in court this morning. Paul Manafort pleading not guilty to a rewritten set of charges, including money laundering, conspiracy, and lying about his foreign lobby work. Manafort's trial is set to begin on September 17th. Meantime, the Russia investigation now delving into a period before the 2016 presidential campaign. CNN has learned special counsel Robert Mueller and his team are looking at how Russia might have tried to influence Donald Trump when he was weighing a presidential run. I want to dive a little deeper now with our panel. Seth Waxman is a criminal defense attorney, former federal prosecutor. CNN political reporter Rebecca Berg and CNN political director David Chalian also with us. As we look at this car I just mentioned, what Ken Starr had to say, take a listen.
I think it's beyond his mandate. The mandate is what happened during the 2016 election in terms of collusion. That's the key idea.
Seth, do you agree with that? Is it in fact beyond the mandate?
Well, with all due respect, I have to disagree with Mr. Starr on this one. You know, I agree that they are looking at a conspiracy between the Russians and the Trump campaign to influence that 2016 election. But as a former federal prosecutor, having investigated many complex criminal conspiracies, they do not start and drop out of the sky. There is a relationship between these parties that started years ago. And as part of that investigation, the prosecutor is going to want to know what happened. How did they get to know each other? What kind of business transactions were taking place over those months and years leading up to the 2016 election? So to understand the nature of those relationships, especially if there was untoward conduct in those years leading up. So I think that entirely arises out of, and in legal parlance, we would call it as direct evidence of the conspiracy. It's not inadmissible. It's entirely relevant. And I think it fits entirely within Mr. Mueller's scope of his investigation.
So you see it fitting within the scope. David, as we look at this, though, referencing once again what the president said back in July to the New York Times about this red line in terms of going back and looking into finances, how much could this be pushing the president perhaps towards looking at Robert Mueller once again a bit more closely?
Well,
right.
I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry. I think you have to realize here, Erica, that in this process, the president doesn't actually get to draw red lines. Yes, we should be on the lookout for his response to this, and if he lashes out in some way in response to this reporting. But I don't think Bob Mueller is all that concerned with political red lines, if you will, that President Trump is drawing to try to circumscribe, I guess, this investigation to a place he feels comfortable.
In terms of lashing out, we did see the president, though, lash out today on Twitter, of course, against his own attorney general, calling him disgraceful in all caps. And in some ways, too, contradicting his own press secretary, who we just heard from Rebecca. Is there a sense of how much more Jeff Sessions is willing to take here?
Well, we've already seen Jeff Sessions to date take a great deal of abuse from the president, Erica. I mean, this is not by any means a new phenomenon that we're seeing, but Jeff Sessions has shown that he is not willing to step down from this job. I mean, he offered his resignation, or suggested to the president earlier in the term that he would offer his resignation if it would please the president, but President Trump didn't show much of an appetite for actually firing Jeff Sessions. So given that, Jeff Sessions is just in a position where he's having to take this abuse from the president and do his job day to day. But we've seen to date that Jeff Sessions is willing to put up with that from the president and do what he thinks is right. The funny thing is, in this situation, that Jeff Sessions is doing fundamentally what the president wants. He's just not going about it in the way that the president would prefer.
Which we saw definitely in that tweet. When we look at, there's so much going on here today, I have to say. I'm jumping around a little bit, but we have so much to cover on a day, especially when any other day, really, we'd be looking at Paul Manafort pleading not guilty. And in the scope of things today, we have to move on to other things like Jared Kushner. So the downgrade in his status, the ripple effect that we're seeing there. David, when we look at this, is this a win for John Kelly, or could it be a nail in his coffin?
Well, it's certainly a loss for Jared Kushner. There's no doubt that this was a rough day and a day of rough headlines for Jared Kushner. Having the security clearance downgraded will certainly prevent him from doing some of the activities that he had been doing, assuming that the president himself doesn't just waive that and grant his own authority, which he has certainly the ability to do. But as you heard the president himself, he said he was going to leave this in John Kelly's hands. So you know that John Kelly has been on a mission to bring order and discipline inside this West Wing in a way that he sees fit and how a White House should run. And there is clearly some tension between Kelly and Kushner over this. While publicly their statement suggests there's not, there clearly is some tension. I would add Ivanka Trump to that mix as well, because John Kelly's trying to run a shop where the relatives of the president don't have some avenue of advice that go around him. And this is now part of that.
There's also, as part of the developments involving Jared Kushner, there's also this Washington Post reporting that officials in at least 4 countries were discussing ways that they could essentially exploit Jared Kushner in some ways. When we look at this, Seth, what really matters, obviously, is whether they're successful. And in some ways, this is what you would expect of other countries, right? Looking to find their own way in. Is there more here than the headline, Seth?
Well, I think there could be, to the extent Jared Kushner has been compromised in some way, shape, or form. I mean, that's exactly why Sally Yates, then the United States Attorney General, acting Attorney General, went to the transition team from Trump and told them that Michael Flynn was potentially compromised. And a person that has that kind of access to the President of the United States, of course, his son-in-law being in that kind of position can be completely troubling. And it begs the question, of course, did something more happen that rises up into the President himself? And does that cause the president to be compromised? I mean, that is what Bob Mueller's, a part of his investigation, is looking at. Was there a quid pro quo? Do the Russians have the goods on the president? And has that somehow compromised him? I think that is a part of what Bob Mueller is looking at.
We also saw yesterday Hope Hicks spent more than 8 hours, nearly 9 hours, before the House Intelligence Committee, not talking about anything during her time at the White House, although we do know that she admitted to sometimes telling white lies for the president prior to that time. Rebecca, is there concern at this point within the White House and even circles in Washington as to what those white lies could constitute? Or is this, again, more a case of a headline?
Well, it's certainly a headline. It's certainly interesting. We're going to need to get more detail. What was Hope Hicks lying about to the president? What was her motivation for this? Was it, self-preservation? Was it an attempt not to anger the president unnecessarily? Or was this something more fundamental, potentially more serious? And so ideally, this is something that these committees in Congress and potentially Mueller would be looking at, would be probing the questions that they would be asking. But one of the obstacles for the congressional committees in particular, as we saw with Hope Hicks' testimony yesterday, is that in some cases, these White House officials or former White House officials, in the case of Steve Bannon, for example, are not being forthcoming with with questions pertaining to their time in the White House without invoking executive privilege explicitly.
Rebecca Berg, David Challey, and Seth Waxman, appreciate it. Thank you.